Without much ado, let me move on to the task at hand, which is for me to talk about cultural studies, its evolution, possibilities, and problems. One of the most important problems when one speaks about cultural studies is one can never be sure what one is speaking about. Cultural studies is definitely plural. There are cultural studies, and my cultural studies is definitely not going to be your cultural studies. In a sense, the way in which cultural studies has begun, evolved, and come to be established both within the academia as well as outside has meant that there are several locations, several locutions, several different kinds of schools, trajectories, styles, which clearly prohibit any kind of uniformity or commonalities to be imposed upon cultural studies. In other words, cultural studies done properly resists any idea of a disciplinary thinking. If there is one way to actually describe cultural studies, it would be to say that it is anti-discipline or anti-disciplinary. If you look at the origins of cultural studies, probably even before the term cultural studies was actually introduced, one realizes that it came primarily out of a critique of disciplinary thinking and disciplinary practice within the universities. And when we talk of disciplines, it becomes clear that disciplines as we know them today, in the way in which we seem to take them to be eternal, to be permanent, the way in which we understand knowledge systems being divided, compartmentalized, seen as watertight boxes, that particular method of looking at knowledge in that fashion is essentially a product of modernity. And if we look at knowledge systems in that manner, one realizes that knowledge systems are never permanent, nor are they solid, nor are they stable. Take the case of physics, for example. Physics as a discipline has hardly 400 years of a history. Before that, what we understand today as physics was part of another discipline called natural philosophy. Even today, the Department of Physics in Oxford is called by the name Department of Natural Philosophy. 400 or 500 years back, in Oxford, as in the case of most of the universities in the West, the Department of Natural Philosophy included not only what we understand as the knowledge system called by physics today, but philosophy, cosmology, astronomy, or whatever those things are today. The precedents of that were part of natural philosophy. Newton was a natural philosopher, in the sense that philosophy at that point of time was understood as that which attempts to explain, describe, and understand the world at large. But physics today is a far cry from what it was at that point of time. Philosophy has parted ways from physics. Philosophy has parted ways from astronomy. Philosophy is no longer the earlier kind of discipline where probably an Aristotle could write equally adeptly in both aesthetics, philosophy, physics, and chemistry at the same time. So this method of actually looking at disciplines as clear compartments, clear separate provinces, is essentially a product of modernity. And even the discipline called literature, as we understand it today, has hardly a history of 100, 150 years and nothing more than that. If you were to ask someone who lived in the 16th century, how is literature today with you, that is a question that may probably fall on deaf ears. They wouldn't be able to understand it. In the same way as we would be asking a Renaissance person, how is a Renaissance right now? They wouldn't understand that at that point of time. The establishment of literature as a discipline was primarily connected with the establishment of nations, the formulations of nations, the idea of nationalism, the creation of communities, national communities, which had to be held together in terms of certain commonalities, particularly that of tradition, of language, of faith or religion, and of culture. And in that sense, literature provided, in a way, a particular discourse, a particular province through which some kind of a shared idea of one's own expressive system, of one's own tradition, of one's own relationship, connection with one's own surroundings and one's own world was made possible in terms of a common set of texts. Literature, in that sense, introduced, say, in the late 19th century as an academic subject in British universities, was equally an attempt to establish what one would call a British nation. English literature, for that matter, or any literature in that sense, wherever a sense of the literary or a sense of literature is established, is indelibly connected with the history of nationalities, the history of nations, the history of provinces, the history of communities. Think of Malayalam, for instance. The idea of Malayalam as a separate language in Malayalam literature itself, the connection between Malayalam and the sense of Kerala is so deeply rooted that the story about Pundanam and Melpathur Bhattadiri, the question of actually taking Malayalam away from Sanskrit and attributing it with an identity that is connected with a specific locality and a specific tradition, which disabused itself of the oppressive presence of Sanskrit and saw itself as an independent language, as an independent expressive system, clearly enunciates the fact that there is a very clear connection between literature as an establishment, literature as a discursive pattern, literature as an expressive system, and the establishment of communities. But when literature came to be introduced in the universities, what happened at that point of time was a very, very difficult question that came up. And that question was, okay, fine, there is literature, but how do you define literature? How do you actually evolve a system of pedagogy whereby you can teach literature? This is a question that I would ask you students here, who are here, even researchers and teachers. A student who has learned physics will be able to understand the natural world. He or she will be able to interpret the natural world, explain the way in which it functions. But those students who have learned literature, what do you learn? What do you do? What do you get qualified to do? Do you become writers? Hardly so. What is it that you learn when you learn literature? A chemistry student, when he learns chemistry, he is actually learning about the chemical world, the way in which the chemical world functions, how reactions take place, how elements and compounds are formed, what kind of, shall we say, processes take place in the chemical world. Is there something of that sort when you learn literature? You don't become a writer. So what are you learning? Are you learning poetry? If you're learning poetry, what about poetry do you learn? Do you learn to write poetry? Do you learn to read poetry? Or do you learn to interpret poetry? You understand my question? This is a really ambiguous area when it comes to literary studies. What do we mean by literature is the first question. And when we say we actually identify a set of texts, a particular canon, a particular province as part of literature, how does one decide that this is literature and that is not literature? How does one decide that this qualifies to the adjective, qualifies to the adjective literary, and while something else does not qualify to the adjective literary? Who decides that? On what criteria is it decided? You have your board of studies here. By what criteria do you decide to include an author and exclude another one? By what criteria do you decide to include a text and exclude another one? Are these decisions entirely literary in nature? Are these decisions to do with some other criteria which probably gets expressed unconsciously or sometimes even consciously? Now, the problem that I'm trying to point out is, at the point at which literature came to be established, and literature as a practice, as a pedagogic practice, and the practice of nations, the practice of communities, was, in a certain manner of speaking, the primary prompting, the primary inspiration behind the making of literature. Now, what happened at a later point of time was that, in the earlier instance, while this was what one would call that wave was on its rise up, the same wave of nationalism, the same wave of community formation as waves do. There is a crest and an ebb, there is a rise and a fall. And once nationalism came into its downswing and people started asking questions about nations and about how nations are basically oppressive structures, how in a certain manner of speaking, nations essentially speaking are involved in structures of administration and power in which some people are included and some people are not included, the same kind of questions came to be asked with literature also. And these questions were aided or made possible also because new sets of students started coming into universities. What happened in the initial instance when literature was introduced was that that itself was in one sense a result of a new set of students, a demographic change that took place in the student body of Oxford and Cambridge. If earlier the students who came to these erstwhile elite universities were primarily children of the elite who did not take up education because they needed a job or because they needed economic security, but whose education was basically a pastime of the luxurious, a pastime that they were engaged in, where the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, in inverted commas, beware, anything that is for itself is always a problem. Art for art's sake, knowledge for knowledge's sake, they are all deeply ideological. But when a new set of students came into the universities, primarily women, people of the middle classes, some people who belonged to the working classes, all of a sudden the teaching of the earlier subjects like Greek, Latin, rhetoric, etc. became rather difficult to hold. The term, it's all Greek and Latin to me, actually originated in the late 19th century. Because when a new set of students, primarily of the middle class, primarily women, came and were actually taught Greek classics, they couldn't understand that. It's not that they couldn't understand that, more than that, it was that they didn't want to understand that. There was no connection between their experience, their lives, their particular kind of questions, their problems, and the things that were actually being taught in classes. And these questions became so insistent, and at the same time, the need to establish a British nation was also becoming quite insistent, that English literature came to be effectively a method whereby they could create a sense of a nation, they could create a pedagogical subject whereby these women, these people of the middle classes, could actually get a feeling of Britishness within them, and where they could get a sense of belonging to the nation that was being formed. It is also to be remembered, as some of you would, who have read Gauri Viswanathan, that the establishment of English literature did not happen in Britain first, but in India. That English literature came to be introduced as an academic subject, not in Britain, but in India, in the University of Calcutta, where English was being taught to Indians for the creation of a set of what one would call intermediaries between the British masters and the colonial subjects. Now, the introduction of English as a literary as an academic subject in India was in one sense a testing ground, was in one sense a kind of experiment which they hoped could be imported or brought back into Britain at a later point, in which it did happen. But the interesting thing about it is this. I mean, let me just, as a kind of digression, let me just say this. When English education was introduced in India, the one thing that the British were quite sure of was that they couldn't trust Indians. Indians couldn't be trusted. They had this very strange habit of thinking one thing and showing something else on their faces, as we still happen to have. And strangely indeed, when they looked at us, they realized that even when they were saying no, they would nod like this. And that was a language they couldn't understand. They were not quite sure whether they meant yes or no. Because Indians couldn't be trusted, they also thought that Indians couldn't also be trusted with evaluation or with teaching. And so we had a very curious system, so different from the system in the West, where one person sets the syllabus, another person teaches the syllabus, third person puts up the question paper, a fourth person evaluates, and a fifth person comes up with the result. And we call it by the term confidentiality. And we still labor under the burden of this colonial backdrop, this colonial, shall we say, hangover. And we still protect this idea of confidentiality. What does confidentiality mean? Confidentiality or confidence, what do you need? When there's a teacher teaching a student, and when there is no confidence, faith, belief, trust between the teacher and student, there is no possibility of a real pedagogic exercise possible. But the interesting thing is that even while they introduced this system in India, when they brought it back into Britain, back to Britain, London University, and then in Oxford and Cambridge, they had no doubts. They went back to their system where the teacher created the syllabus, taught the syllabus, evaluated the students, brought out the results, and the students were equally trustworthy as well as the teacher being trustworthy. Just a kind of digression here. The way in which even while we speak of post-colonialism, we still continue with the manners, the structures of colonialism even today, even without knowing that and thinking that that is what is actually correct. Now, the introduction of literature as a result of the coming of a new set of people was later complicated when this demographic shift became even more intense by the 1940s, 50s, and much more intense or probably acute by the 1960s, when an entirely new set of people came to the universities. They were primarily children of the working class. They were first generation learners. Raymond Williams is a great example. Williams, who came from Wales as the son of a farmer and a farming wife, one of a family of 7, first generation learner, and you have a number of such people who came to the universities not because they were in pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but they were actually looking for a possibility of economic survival, a possibility of employment, a possibility of jobs, whereby they could secure their lives. All of a sudden, education had an entirely different kind of profile. University education was no longer the prerogative of the elite, the prerogative of a minority, but university education, that citadel of eliteness, had perforce to be opened to the entry of entirely new people, immigrants, lower class, working class people, people who were first generation learners, which created such a pressure upon the establishment of literature itself that it had to ask serious questions. To put it in a nutshell, the kind of questions that came up at that point of time was simply this. Now, if this is British literature, as happened in a number of other instances, if this is British literature, who decides that this represents Britain? If this is British literature, who decides who's to be included and who's not to be included? And if some people, say the teachers, the people who formulate the curriculum, are the people who make these decisions, by what criteria do they make these decisions? And what qualifications do they have to make these decisions? Do these decisions have any connection with the actual lives of the students who are there in their warm bodies? Does it relate in any way? Does it address in any way the experience of these people? So you have a black boy from London coming into the university, taking up English literature as his major, and he is faced with a number of texts, all written by white people, all written by upper class, middle class people, all writing about the experience of the white man. Never does a black boy find a space for himself in that particular canon of English literature. The same case happens with women. The same case happens with immigrants. The same case happens with all those people who, effectively speaking, are considered and treated as second-class citizens in the British nation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a problem with literature as a discipline. That literature, even when it appears to and claims to represent a land, represent a society, represent a nation, or represent a community, never fully represents anything or anyone. It only represents the few, It only represents a minority. It only represents a powerful minority, and it always excludes the voices of those minorities, those people who are not part of the structures of power. This fact, this question of exclusion, brought up serious questions or serious challenges to the whole idea of the canon. Probably the best example for this would be something that doesn't come from blacks at all, but the question of Robert Burns in British literature. ഞാനിവിടെ മലയാളത്തിൽ ചോദിക്കാറുള്ള ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ പലപ്പോഴും എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഉള്ളൂര് കവിയാവുന്നത്, എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് മോയിൻകുട്ടി വൈദ്യർ പാട്ടുകാരനാവുന്നത് എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചിട്ട്. മോയിൻകുട്ടി വൈദ്യർ എഴുതുന്നത് കവിതയല്ല, പാട്ടാണ്. ഉള്ളൂർ എഴുതുന്നത് കവിതയാണ്, പാട്ടല്ല. ഇതാരാ തീരുമാനിക്കുന്നത്? ഇതാരാണ് നിർണ്ണയിക്കുന്നത്? ചോദ്യം മനസ്സിലായില്ല. In the same way, someone like Robert Burns, who used to write in a language which was heavily inflected by Scottish, the Gaelic language, was never considered as part of the British canon, of the British system, the British literary system. And Robert Burns was always excluded. Now, who decides that? Isn't Burns a part of the British system? Doesn't Scottish Gaelic also define the British culture? Is it just English that defines the British nation? These questions come up quite insistently. And it is at that point that even more fundamental questions started to be asked. Fine, literature is an expressive system, however however minor it may be, however, shall we say, exclusive it may be, literature expresses. One can accept that. But by what criteria do you ascribe literature with the particular attribute of being the best expressive system? If literature expresses, what about the other expressive system? How do you actually define what is literature and what is not literature? If it is written, that which is written is considered as literature, how are we excluding that entire province of orality, of orature, where people have communicated all the time? How do you exclude that entire set of practices, of discourses, whereby people day to day, on a day-to-day basis, in terms of their legends, in terms of their myths, in terms of the stories that they tell each other, how do you exclude those expressive systems where probably there is much greater content of the actual society being expressed there? Why is it, or how is it possible for you to ignore that 99% of expressive systems and focus upon this little, small, minuscule expressive system called written literature and say that this represents that history? Ladies and gentlemen, think for a moment when you write in your examination papers and your articles and your essays, and when you, with impunity, write a sentence like, this work represents the historical epoch of, I don't know, the First World War, the Second World War, whatever it is. By what right do you say this? By what claim do you actually give this attribute that this particular work of literature can express that particular age, that particular ethos, that particular society, while ignoring probably other discourses which are much more immediate? How many people read poetry? Do you get my question? How many people read poetry? How many people need to read poetry? 95% of our population get born, live, die perfectly well without ever having read a line of poetry. In fact, they would function much better than we do because we are burdened by the sense of poetry where even while we walk, we are held back by these lines. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? The way in which a prioritization of literature has taken place, where a number of other expressive systems are completely ignored, becomes a real problem. And the way in which it is institutionalized, what does that mean is a question. Now, I know I'm not speaking of cultural studies, I'm speaking of a number of other things. I know that. But that's the whole point. That's why that has to be spoken, and that's where cultural studies is today. I'll come to that. I'm taking a very tangential kind of trajectory here. I know perfectly well. Now, while this was happening within the universities, on another level, there was another attempt that was going on in Europe at large, what one would call a kind of marked turn towards culture as a constitutive category, trying to understand, trying to put culture forward as something that is very essential, so to speak. Probably the first attempt behind that came from the structuralist enterprise, where language was seen as not something that represents reality, as something that captures reality or reflects reality, but as something that constructs reality. That there is no innate natural connection between a language and the reality that it expresses, that that relationship is conventional, arbitrary, and based primarily upon the difference within that language, sets of difference within that language itself, where you mean a tree not because you mean the tree, but because the tree is different from the other words within the language itself. There is no connection between the graphic or the linguistic symbol tree and the actual tree, but that tree becomes tree because it is different from the other words in the language. Now, if this is the case, one possibility that comes up there is the distinct potential of looking at a number of other discourses which also function as languages. If language is that which a medium with which, or a process through which, a practice through which you actually construct a reality with the use of internal differences, then any practice, any discourse, any kind of functionality through which you construct reality, you represent reality through a system which is similar to language becomes language or can be treated as language. If languages are considered primarily as verbal, we have gesture languages. We have languages of dress, where we are communicating to others what we are and what we think of the world, what our connection to the world is. We have languages of fashion. We have languages of food habits, where everything that we eat, and especially what we don't eat, happen to be statements about who we are, about our identities, about our communities, about our positions and relationships to the world. We have languages of space, where this space requires a certain kind of expressive modality, a certain formality, a certain kind of decorum that other spaces do not require. In other words, if language can be taken as a model, language can be taken as the primary model to understand the world, then it would be possible to look at a number of discourses in a linguistic system, as part of a linguistic system, or as functioning like a linguistic system. This was exactly what Roland Barthes attempted to do. When Roland Barthes came up with the idea of secondary signification, and when he asked the question of how aspects of popular culture, pictures, images, different kinds of, shall we say, popular discourses, construct reality or communicate reality in the way of language, what Barthes essentially envisaged was a possibility of coming up with a science of science, where everything that communicates, every gesture, every action, every word, every functionality that communicates can be seen in terms of a language, whereby those unconscious production of meanings can actually be analyzed and interpreted and understood in terms of the underlying semiotic systems that are present within it. Take the case of that famous example that Barthes actually speaks about in his mythologies. The Algerian soldier standing in salute in front of the French flag, something which you're all familiar with. Now, what does it say in the front in terms of its apparent meaning? It's very simple. The picture speaks for itself. You have the Algerian flag, and from the French flag. From the tricolor, you understand that it is a French flag. It's a direct communication. The uniform of the soldier makes it clear that he is a colonial soldier, part of the French Algerian army, and his facial features, not his entire blackness, but Algerians are primarily Berbers, and from his features, you understand that he's not French, he's not European, but he is part of the Algerian nationality, he's part of the Algerian community. From this is how you read it. You have an Algerian soldier standing in salute in front of a French flag. But is that what it says? That's a question that Barthes asks. No, it is not that. It's not entirely what it says. It's something else which functions at a much deeper level, where the salute of the Algerian soldier in front of a French flag enunciates a certain colonial principle, where the picture seems to tell us that even the Algerian colonized people accept the supremacy of the French flag, the supremacy of French imperialism. In other words, what one would call the internalization of inferiority that you find as part of any kind of exercise of colonization is here institutionalized, is here picturized, is here put through in terms of an image whereby that idea is given physical form, visual form in terms of this particular salute that this Algerian soldier is giving to the French flag. Now, if it is possible to look at it that way, then what Barth proposed was that there are two levels of signification. The first level of apparent primary signification, but a second level where that entire significatory practice, that entire sign, becomes part of another significatory chain where it becomes a signifier and there is another sign, another signified that actually is derived from that. If that is the case, isn't it possible, is a question that Barth asked, that every cultural practice, day-to-day practices, the kind of images that you see, the kind of discourses that you come across in your daily life, don't they all have secondary significations? Won't it be possible for us to read them or parse them or open them up to actually come out with the underlying signification whereby the unconscious meanings that are present in cultural signals can actually be brought out? Where it becomes possible for you to read the entirety of culture, every practice, every discourse of culture, as part of a comprehensive linguistic system which functions in terms of a secondary signification and where notions, ideas, messages to do with power, messages to do with supremacy, messages to do with connections or relationships are actually subtly being propagated or communicated through these particular signs. Barth's was a very ambitious venture, and a venture which was doomed to failure precisely because of its extreme ambition. And it did fail. What came out of it was pretty mighty little, because to actually have, the problem with Barth was that Barth did not actually talk about or try to understand the formal differences between different kinds of discourses, to actually collapse, to encapsulate, to bring together all these different discourses despite the differences of form. One could be a verbal form, one could be a pictorial form, another would be a moving image, a third would be a graphic form, a fourth would be an audio image. But to actually collapse all these different forms, all these genres into one single category would inevitably do violence to the formal features and probably inhibit any kind of deeper understanding. But let us face this, that was a possibility. That's still a possibility. But what it opened more than anything else is not the question of coming up with the science of science, but the possibility that every discourse, every action in this world that we do, that we engage in, consciously or unconsciously, has meanings, and they can be understood. They could be interpreted. That's the whole point. That's the whole point, whether we are conscious of it or not. The way I stand here right now, my gestures would mean several things that I myself probably do not understand. The way I've dressed and come here in the particular fashion that I've come here may communicate and does communicate meanings to you at a different level than from the obvious one. How do we understand that? In other words, communities, groups, identities are constructed not through the apparent level of communication, but the unapparent level of communication, the deeper level of signification, which functions on an unconscious level sometimes in a partially conscious level, but where the communication signals are constantly received, interpreted, imbibed, and people respond in terms of that. Just ask yourself the simple question. How many times in your life have you just met a person and immediately formed an idea about what kind of a person he or she is? On what basis do you do that? It's your experience of having unconsciously read the signals of a number of people who went before, and on the basis of that, you take a look at him and say, ha, there you go. You understand? How do you understand that? You are being Barth. You are being Roland Barthes in a certain manner of speaking. What Barth attempted to do was to systematize that, to create a structure, a science out of these reading of science. That is on the one side. On another level, something else that came up was, especially in terms of a crisis of Marxism, when within Marxism itself, this is outside the academia, within Marxism itself, the idea of culture as a secondary discourse, as something that is not primary, the idea of the base structure and the superstructure, and where economy was seen as a base structure, the engine of society, the relations of production, the methods of production, the modes of production, forming the essential core of a society, determining its form and content, while culture is only in effect part of the superstructure. This kind of a mechanistic structural view of society, though Marx is partially guilty of doing that, Marx also has to be credited with saying, with clearly clarifying that that was not his intention at all. Even while he saw literature and other aspects of culture, politics, cultural practices, etc., not as part of economy, but as an effect of economy, he was always clear, both Marx and Engels were always clear, that culture had autonomy. It is not culture, that culture is a second order construct, culture is a direct effect of economy, but culture had, ultimately speaking, culture was autonomous, and that it is only in the final instance that economy shall assert itself. But unfortunately, what happened within the structures of official Marxism, of conventional Marxism, was that this mechanical view of culture as something that is a second order construct, something that is a direct effect of the economy, something which doesn't have autonomy of its own, which doesn't have an entity of its own, as something that is merely a reflection of economy, came to take root and came to flourish. Now, this became the official party line of most of the communist parties, and especially in Soviet Russia, this became part of the system itself, the understanding of system itself. That's where we have ideas of Shadanovism, etc., where culture was seen as an expression of the party, culture was merely seen as an expression of the party line. What happened in Western Marxism was that Western Marxism found itself in a very curious kind of situation. And this is it's a great curiosity of Marxism, that if capitalism, according to Marxism, would complicate itself, reach its ultimate, reach its most mature form, and that mature form would spawn the kind of contradictions that would mean or end in its own collapse, then if Marxism's recipe or Marx's recipe were correct or partially correct, it would have meant that revolutions should have taken place in the most developed economies of the West. Places like France, Germany, Spain, Britain, etc. But revolutions took place, in the two instances where you look at it, revolutions took place primarily in Russia and in China, both of them not capitalist at all. They were primarily agrarian societies, feudal societies in their own manner, and it was not a revolution which came out of the complications, the contradictions that were spawned by the growth of capitalism. So, on the one hand, what you find in Western Marxism was this peculiar kind of quandary. On the one hand, you had these revolutions in Russia and China, but these revolutions offered up regimes or structures of government which turned out to be even more oppressive than the oppressive structures that they attempted to replace. And on the other hand, over there in the West, where according to the recipe, if things went according to recipe, things were so ripe for revolution to take place, no revolution was taking place. 1968 was an extremely crucial year. 1968 was a year in which it appeared, for a moment at least, that things would change. The huge revolts that took place in Paris, where students and the working class came together, like what happened during the French Revolution, they stormed the Bastille, they actually came out in processions on the streets of Paris, and the de Gaulle government was forced to actually flee from the country and become a government in exile. And where, as a result of which, the spread, or the spirit of revolution, the spirit of rebellion, spread to other parts of Europe. The London School of Economics sit-in, the anti-Vietnam struggles in the United States, even in India, we had echoes of the same thing. It seemed to be a kind of phase where the student bodies of different countries, the working classes of different countries, were allying with one another where the marginalized people were actually coming together in order to take power into their hands, it seemed to hold out a distinct possibility, a real possibility. It is almost like the Arab Spring in one sense, what happened in the Arab countries. It was a civilian unrest. But unfortunately, nothing came out of it. We had great cinema coming out of it, great works of art coming out of it. The entire neo-realism movement, even our own Kumar Shaini included, created great films from the inspiration of that particular 1968 revolutionary fervor, but no palpable political change came out of it. On the other hand, what 1968 brought in its wake was a much greater awareness on the parts of the government that tighter controls, more and more tight controls, greater presence of the police, of the military was necessary, and which is where you find the startings of the kind of powerful governments where no kind of dissent is possible, as we see right now, had its beginning. This particular quandary, on the one hand, that the revolutions that took place in Russia and China did not offer the kind of freedom or the kind of liberation that they seem to offer, and on the other hand, the absence of any possibility of real change in the West. This brought up a real problem for Western Marxist theoreticians. And it was at that point where the inability or the impossibility of actual intervention in the political sphere enforced them to actually turn to culture and look at culture as that space, that province, that ground upon which their intervention can be brought in, created the possibility of a new kind of understanding of culture. Culture not as a secondary category, culture not as something that is derivative, but culture as constitutive and primary. Probably the best example of that, or the first instance of that, was definitely the work of the Frankfurt School. The work of Adorno and Horkheimer is extremely crucial because what is important about probably in an essay like Cultural Industry is that the division between culture and economy that was so considered so central to Marxism, that division was being bridged, where culture came to be seen as, primarily as economic in nature, not secondary in that sense. Let me give you an example that probably some of my students here have already heard, but which will make it clear to you. You've probably read the book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. You've heard of that book at least. Yes. Now, I was an MA student when I first read this book, and I was, the first time I saw that book, I was very surprised. I'm not talking of the second edition, but the first edition. I saw this in the Modern Book House in Trivandrum, and what I saw was, this book was there, and the book started from the cover page. The cover was the first page of the novel, and it starts off like this. You're about to start reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, and it just starts. I got so curious that I took it and looked at it. It was a white cover with a print on that, and this entire first page is there. Of course, there was the first page inside, but the first page was there. Intrigued by that, I borrowed the book. I didn't have the money to buy it. I thought I could beat Professor Panikar into buying it for the library, which I did manage to do after I read it. He was good in that sense, even though not so very good in many other senses. Took the book and started reading it. So what happens in that book is, I don't want to destroy it for you, but you start reading and you're being told you're about to start reading Italo Calvino's new novel. You've heard about its publication from newspapers, etc., and you wanted to buy that book. You've been waiting for the day that the book would be released in bookshops, and the day has come, and so you walk into a bookshop in search of this book, and while you're going into the bookshop, you go beyond a number of shelves. On your left, you have books that you've read and you don't want to read again. On the right, you have books that you always wanted to read but never have been able to read. Then you have books that you've claimed to have read but not really read, and so on and so forth. These classes of books, one after the other. And then you finally, happen upon this book. You pick it up and you come to the counter to buy it, and there, of course, there is another reader who is a beautiful woman. who's also buying this book. At that point, you talk. And it is then that you realize that the you is not you, but a you in the book. Okay, you talk to this beautiful lady. She talks to you back, and she also talks about how she has read about this book and she has been waiting expectantly for the book. So the book is bought, and you get into the bus. And while in the bus, you're so excited in having acquired this book and you want to start reading it straight away because you don't have a seat, you're standing, you're holding on to the line above, and while holding on to the line above, you try to take the book out of the brown paper wrapper, try to open it, and by the time you manage to extricate the book from the wrapper and open it, you've arrived at the stop that you have to alight, so you get out and you go back home, where you decide to start reading. And there is the family members there, people are watching TV, you don't want to be disturbed, you go into the study and you sit. You don't want to be disturbed by the TV, so you decide to close the door. You close the door, you become very comfortable, you sit on the chair, you put your feet up on a stool next, and then suddenly you remember, oh, what if someone knocks on the door? Then I'll have to go and get up and open the door, so probably I shouldn't really shut the door, so you go and leave the door a bit ajar, so that even if someone knocks, you can say, yes, come in. After all this, shall I say, let me use the word foreplay, the actual book starts. And the first thing is, if on a winter's night. That's the first chapter, first part. And it is a story about someone who's arriving at a railway station with a red suitcase. And he has only one instruction, that he has to alight at a particular station. Another train will come in the opposite direction, and another person will alight there. He will carry an identical suitcase. They will meet, sort of collide on the platform. They will both drop their suitcases. One will take the others and then walk away and get into the other trains and leave the station. Perfect plan. The only problem was that by the time this man arrives here, the other train has come and gone. And he has no clue what to do. There is no further instructions about plan B. There is no plan B. There is only plan A. And so he's there with this flaming red suitcase, having no idea what to do about it. And he walks into the pub in the railway station. And there he walks straight into a huge conflict situation where involving the mayor, the chief of the police, and the wife of the former wife of the chief of police, and the current wife of the mayor. She happens to be the same. So this is the situation that he walks into. And the police chief walks into the pub, sees him, walks past him, and just as he walks past him, he says, "What are you doing here? Get out of here quick." We have no idea who this man is. He could be part of an espionage ring. He could be part of a criminal organization. He could be part of anything. We don't know. But the story builds up. And the story builds up and reaches a point where it is almost like you're so gripped. And then you flip the page. And when you flip the page, it's partly half of the sentence there. The next half, you flip the page and it says chapter 2. What do? So you flip back again. And it's, mid-sentence, you flip again, it's chapter 2. So what you do is, are there two, is there a page pasted together? This is what you do, this is what I did, this is what everyone would do. And you try this, no, it's a single page. And then you start reading chapter 2 and you're told, yes, this is what has happened to that reader. He turned the page and found that the story has stopped midway, or, at a very climactic point, and he's back to page 1 again in that book. Not in the book that we are reading, but in the book that he is reading. He has reached page 16, he's turned the page, and instead of finding page 17, he finds page 1. Now, then he looks at the rest of the book, and he realizes that there are only 16 pages in the book. Repeated again and again and again and again. So obviously, there is a binding mistake here. Because instead of these different 16 pages coming together, it's one set of 16 pages bound together. Frustrated, angry. Well, this is what happens when you read the whole If on a Winter's Night Traveler. what Calvino has done is to actually sacrifice 10 eminently good novels for the sake of this. Each of these novels are like this. They start off, they grip you, and it gets broken off. And then some other reason comes up. Like 10 of these novels, but altogether something else comes out. I don't want to, if there are some poor victims who would like to read that, I don't want to, kind of take away their pleasure. But I have a simple question. Why these 16 pages? What is the value of 16 pages? Do you understand my question? Why did Italo Calvillo come up with 14 pages and then the 15th page missing? Or why not 26 pages and the 27th page onwards missing? Why 16 pages? Why specifically 16? Or is my question stupid? It could very well be. Oh, it's just 16 pages. Yeah, anyone? Please feel free to say. Any answer is right and every answer is wrong. So don't worry. Sweet 16. Well, every answer is right, but every answer is wrong. I'll put you out of your misery. It's very simple. In printing, they print in forums. A forum is 8 pages one side, 8 pages the other side. So if you take one of your books, any book in your hand, you look at it, page 1, page 2. And if you look at the other side, not the new computer printings, but the earlier kind of printings, the other side, you'll have 1 will be here, and the other side will be 16. Am I clear? Do you understand this? This would be 1, this would be 16. This would be 2, this would be 15. All right. Like that, 8 pages will be on one side, 8 pages on the other side. And this is printed and cut, and when it is cut, and you can put these 2 pages together, one inside the other, and one set will be 16 pages. Okay. What has happened is a very simple thing. So forum 1 followed by forum 2 followed by forum 3 is how a book is bound. But what has happened in this case is that the first forum has been bound together instead of other forums following it, fora following it. Do you understand? Am I clear? What does this indicate? What this indicates is that the book, as much as it is a novel, as much as it is an intellectual exercise, as much as it is a cultural product, cultural thing, it is an industrial product. Ultimately, it's an economic product. We speak about texts reflecting reality. We speak about texts reflecting the economy. What we seldom consider the possibility, the actual reality, that these texts are part of that very economic reality. That they are products of that economic reality. They are products of processes which are industrial, which are capitalist in nature, which are systems where you cannot differentiate between the production of a book and the production of a tire. You cannot differentiate between the production of a book and the production of a toy. And that's when you suddenly remember what happened to Charlie Chaplin in modern times. Okay, where the connection, the production system, the conveyor belt, that's the same way in which culture is also produced. Adorno and Horkheimer brought this to the fore. Not in these terms, they did not speak about Italo Calvino, they could not have. But what Adorno and Horkheimer brought to the fore was that culture was not a second order construct. Culture is as much a province of economy. Culture is an economic product as much as anything else. And the deep linkages, economic linkages, between cultural production and other forms of production. It is not incidental, ladies and gentlemen, that Manorama is also the owner of MRF tires. So cultural production and tire, it's not entirely inadvertent that I mentioned tires in the previous sentence. Tires are very important cultural products, just as newspapers are extremely important commercial products. They are very, very close in that sense. So what the Frankfurt School brought to the fore, and when you come to Walter Benjamin, again, is a way in which mechanical reproduction has completely altered, transformed, completely amended the earlier system of reception, and where we can make infinite copies whereby there is no question of the original. It is to Benjamin's credit that Benjamin's understanding of Benjamin's article made the fullest sense not at his own time, but by the time that we started living with mobile phones. Think of a photograph that you have taken on your mobile screen, and then you put it on WhatsApp and share with other people. I have a simple question. Which is the original of that photograph? Does it have an original? Is the photograph on your mobile screen the original and the others copies? What if someone uses Photoshop or any of the editing devices to actually change that? Does that become an original? In the case of earlier photography, it used to be the case that the negative, strangely indeed, the negative is the original. Okay. Or in painting, you have an original which is copied by others. But in digital photography, what is the original? Is there an original? Or are they all copies? Do you understand? They are all copies. So in that sense, this whole idea of authority, this whole idea of original and copies become very complicated. And Walter Benjamin, what he actually pointed out was that shift towards photography and towards cinematography, where the idea of the original becomes very, very untenable, and where the idea of mechanical reproduction, of infinite production. I've seen Mona Lisas with mustaches. I've even sat, sad to say, on toilet seats which had Mona Lisa there. It's very difficult to sit on a toilet seat which has a picture of Mona Lisa. Japan has this strange habit of using all kinds of absolutely atrocious imagery in their toilets. So it becomes very difficult. But that's how it is. So where the earlier idea of Mona Lisa as something that you see in the Louvre, where you stand with due reverence and is completely surprised that is this small little bit of a painting, the so-called famed painting, but still the original is there. But when it gets spread in such a fashion, when it gets relocated in a number of different places, what is the original, what is the actual copy becomes really difficult. With all this, what happened was, culture was no longer a secondary thing. On the one hand, you have the complication, the conflicts, the real problematization of the category of literature. On the other hand, you have what I termed as the cultural turn, where culture came to be seen as constitutive, as Raymond Williams puts it. Culture came to be seen as constitutive, culture came to be seen as economical, culture came to be seen as the province whereby people express themselves, people articulate themselves, people enunciate their relationship to the world, to God, to his own or her own self, to the other people around, in terms of different languages, in terms of different discourses, and where the attempt was to make sense of one's own entity, one's own identity in one way or another, and communicate that to the others. So the whole question of culture as secondary came to be rejected, and culture came to be seen as primary. But at the same time, there was another parallel trajectory evolving at the same time. And that had to do with the question of power, of how culture, just as they are significatory practices, just as every moment of your lives, whether waking or asleep, you're constantly communicating meanings about yourself and the world. On the other hand, these meanings that are communicated, these discourses, these transactions, these practices are never ever innocent. They are never innocent. They are always already invested with, imbued with values and structures of power. A number of theoreticians brought this idea from different levels. Probably the first instance would be Althusser, who thought about ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, and saw ideology as a lived relation to the real. What Althusser, apart from the apparatuses issue, what Althusser brought up was this idea that you never understand the world as it is. You understand the world through your living relationship with this world. And with that living relationship, you have a subjective idea, to use a rather inadequate term, a subjective idea of what this world is. And your subjective idea of what this world is not merely something that is limited to your experience alone, but always determined, dictated by certain structures of perception, certain structures of cognition, certain structures of interpretation, which are propagated in any society at any given point of time. So the lived relation to the real, the way in which you live, the way in which you connect to the real through your life. And when you speak of your life, you're speaking also of your position within a certain society, whether you're part of the marginalized or part of the powerful, whether you're part of the majority or the minority, whether you're part of a linguistic system or another linguistic system. All these issues come into it, so that at each point of time in your life, you're constantly and continuously, incessantly engaged in interpreting the world according to certain structures, certain patterns that are made available to you. That's ideology, ladies and gentlemen. So ideology, if the earlier Marxist notion of ideology was as false consciousness, with Althusser, ideology came to be seen not merely in terms of truth value, the right and the wrong, the right understanding of reality and the wrong understanding of that reality. Such binary notion of ideology or reality came to be overcome, and where every moment of your life you are engaged in, involved in the practice of ideology, which in one way or another is connected with structures of supersedence, such structures of power, structures of governmentality, structures of community, etc., which determine the form of society at a particular point of time. Now, Althusser, the famous example of ideological state apparatus and repressive state apparatus, again, which is a rather simplistic version or a simplistic application of this idea of ideology, where he said that structures of power or governments or states do not further their aims merely through structures of violence such as those of the police, the military, the courts, etc., but also through the practice of ideology, where from the earliest moment of time, when you're born and when you're brought up in a family, and then you're taken to a school, and then you read newspapers, and then you read books, and then you go to colleges, etc. There is a sense of reality that is being constantly bombarded upon you, which you internalize and which you function. My wife is an administrator in a school, and so she told me of an extremely interesting little incident when a little boy was brought for admission to the school, and he was asked, "What is your name?" He said, "No, Niranjan." He was asked what is his name, and his name is Niranjan, but he said, "No, Niranjan." So she couldn't understand at first. Then she realized that the poor boy has never heard his name being uttered just as Niranjan, but it's always, "No, Niranjan." Okay, that no, this idea of what is not to be done, what is not acceptable, which is kind of injected into him from the time he was hardly 2 or 1. And from that point onwards, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is right, what is wrong, all these come into a structure, a large structure of ideology, of understanding, of interpretation of what you understand of the world. So, in that sense, in all of these, there are the seeds of power. When following Althusser, the work of Gramsci, the work of a number of people like that, but probably culminating in the most important work, that of Foucault, where he saw society itself in terms of a panopticon of a particular structure of society, of a particular structure of the prison, where there is a central tower from which it is said, or it is assumed, that you're constantly being observed. And because you're constantly being observed, you've internalized this notion that you're constantly being observed. You don't need someone in that particular viewing tower, but the viewing tower is inside yourself. Think of what is happening to us right now. Think of how, in one way or another, we censor ourselves at each point of time, afraid of those people who would be always, continuously, വികാരം വ്രണപ്പെടാൻ നിൽക്കുന്ന കുറേ ആൾക്കാരുണ്ടല്ലോ, അവരെ പേടിച്ചിട്ട് നമ്മൾ പറയേണ്ടത് തന്നെ പറയാതിരിക്കുന്നത്, വ്രണപ്പെട്ടാലും ഇല്ലെങ്കിലും നമ്മൾ ആദ്യം ഈ വ്രണപ്പെടുന്ന കാര്യം ആലോചിച്ചിട്ട് പേടിച്ച് നമ്മൾ സ്വയം സെൻസർ ചെയ്യുന്നൊരവസ്ഥ. Just think of that. That's a panopticon inside you. A panopticon which, even without the presence of an observer, of a power, of a point of power, you internalize your own subjectiveness, or you're becoming an object of that power, and you become agents of that power with your own actions. Effectively, power spawns itself. Power reproduces itself, not in terms of what Althusser spoke about, the repressive apparatus, but in terms of an internalization of that power, where you yourself become your jailer. You yourself become your observer. You yourself become the policeman inside you, always checking, making sure that you never cross the line. What Foucault brought to the fore was that there is nothing in this world which is, in one way or another, not touched by power. Everything is connected to power. Even attempts to resist power is also touched by power. Even attempts to actually rebel is also enriched or also inspired by other values of power. Every discourse, every action, every transaction is in one way or another connected to the structures of power. It expresses anticipations of power. It expresses, shall we say, the internalized patterns of power. Ladies and gentlemen, culture then becomes not a trivial thing. Culture becomes something very crucial. Culture, every practice when it is connected to ideology, every practice when it is connected to the structures of power, everything that we do, inadvertently even, probably much more importantly when it is done inadvertently, becomes Freud again. Think of Freud. The connection is maybe not so apparent, but even a slip of the tongue, you think what I say is what expresses me. Hardly so. It is the slip of the tongue that expresses me much more. So when I make a mistake and when I say something that I never wanted to say, but something in me, my unconscious prompts me to say, that is the real me, probably. Much more so than what I really wanted to say, what I think I wanted to say. So that slip of the tongue, where you bite the tongue, that little figment of imagination that comes up as a dream in your half-waking hours, those images which are in the penumbra between, shall we say, acceptability and unacceptability, between decency and vulgarity, between those, shall we say, structures of yes and no, those things which we are ashamed of. That's why slip of the tongue is always that's a slip of the tongue. Because in a slip of the tongue, you say something that you're not expected to say. Me being a professor, I'm not probably expected to come up with a profanity. But sometimes it comes out. And that is me. That's a real me. That's a me that I've tried to suppress. I'm not just talking of me. That's a me that I've tried to suppress. But inadvertently it comes out. So that which is inadvertent is probably the most expressive of who we are, what we are. അറിയാത്ത തെറിവാക്ക് കെട്ടിക്കിടന്നെൻ്റെ നാവ് കുഴയുന്നു എന്ന് KG ശങ്കരപ്പിള്ള എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അത് ഇത് തന്നെയാണ്. പറയാത്ത തെറിവാക്ക് കെട്ടിക്കിടന്നെൻ്റെ നാവ് കുഴയുന്നു എന്ന് പറയും. ആ പറയാത്ത തെറിവാക്ക് പറഞ്ഞു പോകും. മനസ്സിലാവുണ്ടല്ലോ, അവിടെയാണ് സപ്രഷൻ, അത് പറഞ്ഞു പോകും എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ so what I'm trying to say here is that the whole system of expression or inexpression in that sense becomes a much more becomes a province that is much deeper than what was understood before. And this, ladies and gentlemen, to put it very simply, is a province of cultural studies. This is a province of cultural studies where culture insinuates itself, where culture brings itself out, not in terms of earlier compartmentalized systems or formal systems of literature, music, etc., etc., but in terms of those informal, those unstructured systems of expression which probably elide or avoid or sidetrack such formalities and come out with expressions which are probably much more elemental, probably much more fundamental. And that is a real province of cultural studies. I'll just conclude with a couple of things. I know I probably have not made a lecture on cultural studies as you would have expected it. That's hardly my intention. So this is a way of looking at it in a different way. But what has happened to cultural studies is precisely this. And I'm sorry to say this. Cultural studies as it is practiced in academia, especially in the wake of what happened in the United States, when it came to be accommodated and appropriated into popular culture studies, is that culture studies has become just another discipline. That which culture studies attempted to subvert, to question, to challenge, culture studies has become exactly that. There is this famous character called King Midas. King Midas turned into gold everything that he touched. And till a point arrived where he couldn't eat anything, but whatever he touched, turned into gold. Capitalism has a very similar touch. It turns into a commodity, everything that it touches. And the United States of America turns into something else, which is the color of gold, everything that it touches. So this is what has happened to cultural studies too. Cultural studies has become an easy kind of system, where the structures of critique that are already received, and I think I should mention one thing more here, and which, well, you can critique me for having ignored that or forgotten that, and that is the input of feminism into cultural studies. There you go, feminists should object that I never mentioned that before. It came as an afterthought, critique for possibility of feminism. There you go. Masculinity parading itself, masquerading itself, there you go there. Now, what feminism actually brought into consideration was this question of the other, and where every discourse in one way or another constructs either a visible or an invisible other, and in fixing that other as the opposite, as the victim, as that which has to be erased, cultural discourse, every cultural discourse in one way or another is inspired by the structures of not only power but of masculinities, and continuing on from feminism in terms of post-coloniality, in terms of subalternity, the idea of the other, how it is so deeply rooted within the very parameters of culture, within the very paradigms of culture, came to the fore. What I'm trying to say is this, unfortunately, this entire structure within the academia, if cultural studies is primarily political and it was directed towards a kind of alteration of society, the possibility of alterity, as Catherine Belsey puts it, the possibility of change, the possibility of transformation, where cultural studies was not merely a knowledge for knowledge's sake, but cultural studies was definitely an attempt to look at the world in our skins, to actually critique the world, and through that critique try to alter and change the world for a more humane world, for a better world, where structures of oppression, structures of discrimination, structures of exclusion, or structures of power could be progressively and systematically dismantled and replaced by more humane structures. What's the possibility that cultural studies envisaged throughout? In academia, it has become a mannerism, a pure mannerism. A mannerism in the sense that you have the self-same objections coming up again and again and again. The self-same allegations coming up again and again and again, leading nowhere else but just to the award of degrees and grades and marks. Nothing more than that. Culture studies has lost its teeth. Culture studies has lost its nails. Culture studies has become just another very domesticated, very, very comfortable area where people can come and say, oh, I'd like to do a PhD in culture studies. So that is unfortunately the situation largely here. But glad to say at the same time that again, it is not the academia which is actually taking the other route. If you look at the work today of subaltern studies people, of Dalit scholars, of feminists who are outside the academia, entirely outside the academia, but whose critique, whose interpretations, whose analysis come not from a shall we say, a vapid obsession with theory, but whose interpretations, whose readings come from a direct addressing of concrete actual experience and reality. The kind of critiques that come from their own experiences of living in a world today, living in a particular structure today, living in a particular context today, inspired by that, the kind of critiques that come from Dalit writers, of Dalit not academicians, Dalit activists, work by feminist activists, by subaltern activists, is probably what holds out as a future for cultural studies. Because where they have come to be informed not by the academic work, academic side of cultural studies, but by the theorizations that originally inspired cultural studies. Let me just conclude by saying this. Culture studies, if it becomes or if it continues on the same trajectory as what it has established itself as within the academia, culture studies will become just another kind of study which is similar to literary study or sociology or political science. And the sad part is that in such studies, methodology is what comes first. And you have methodological culture studies, the methodology of culture studies in terms of the theoretical patterns coming to the fore. I had an interesting little enumeration done the other day, looking at all the new books which have come out from 2015 onwards on culture studies. 70%, I came up with a list of nearly 37 books. And what I realized on looking at the titles, sorry, I was not interested in reading any of them. I just looked at the titles primarily. And one thing was very clear. 70% of these books dealt with the methodology of culture studies. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Midas touch. Because the idea of disciplinary methodology, of creating a foolproof system of analysis with which one could actually turn culture studies into a discipline itself, is the exact opposite of what culture studies originally envisaged itself to be. It is an opposite, it is contrary to its very history and its origins. In that sense, it would be better for culture studies to die a natural death. Thank you.